There is a kind of fear we no longer see, not because it's gone, but because it's been normalized, woven quietly into the fabric of modern life. It's the fear of being watched, not by gods or spirits, but by systems, by data, by eyes we cannot see, but always feel. Surveillance today is not a prison cell, it's a lens, a mirror, a psychological state of vigilance. We live under the gaze of invisible judges, where silence itself feels suspicious, and privacy becomes a rebellion. But what if fear is not just a consequence of this gaze? What if it is the goal? Philosopher Bertrand Russell once wrote that freedom is the absence of fear. In our hyper-connected world, we must ask, have we given up that freedom in exchange for comfort or control? This is a story about fear, about freedom, and about how Russell's century-old warning might be more urgent now than ever before. For much of modern psychology, fear has been treated as functional, a mechanism wired for survival. We fear predators, pain, isolation, because fear kept us alive. Evolution carved fear into the nervous system like a silent alarm. Later, Freud saw fear not just as reaction, but repression. The ego, he said, constructs defense systems to keep fear out of conscious awareness. In this view, fear was the shadow haunting every neurosis, every irrational behavior, every dream. Then came the behaviorists, B.F. Skinner, John Watson, who stripped fear of metaphor. Fear became learned behavior, nothing more than a predictable chain of stimulus and response. The rat fears the shock. The child fears punishment. Conditioning replaced mystery with control. Clean, mechanical. These theories gave us comfort. They suggested that if fear could be learned, it could be unlearned. Fear could be managed. But Bertrand Russell approached fear not as biology or behavior, but as philosophy. In his essay, Freedom and the Colleges, Russell argued that fear is the greatest obstacle to truth. He saw fear not as animal instinct, but as a tool of control. Fear of authority, fear of disapproval, fear of stepping out of line. And when fear becomes systemic, embedded in education, religion, or government, truth begins to rot. Because no one dares to speak it, no one dares to live it. Russell believed that institutions that rely on fear are not protecting us. They are paralyzing us. And here lies the contradiction. In a world obsessed with safety, we may have created structures that eliminate danger. By eliminating dissent, we have confused peace with obedience, freedom with order. But Russell saw through it. He believed that fear and freedom are opposites, that one cannot coexist with the other, and that any society built on fear, even the subtlest kind, cannot call itself truly free. That's the background theory. A fear that is no longer primal, but institutional, quiet, polite, and devastating. Here is the paradox. The more we fear disorder, the more order becomes our prison. The more we crave safety, the more surveillance becomes invisible. Because we welcome it. We don't resist the camera, we install it ourselves. Russell warned of this inversion. That fear can masquerade as morality, as reason, as progress. When fear is internalized, there is no need for force. The citizen becomes their own warden. The student censors their question. The worker self-monitors, smiling beneath surveillance. We have created a world where fear does not feel like fear. It feels like normality. Russell saw this long before digital monitoring existed. He saw it in authoritarian governments, in rigid religions, in dogmatic education. The system doesn't need violence when it has internal compliance. And this is where fear evolves. from external threat to internal obedience. You no longer need to be punished to feel watched. You only need to believe someone could be watching. Psychologists call this the panopticon effect, a concept first imagined by philosopher Jeremy Bentham. A prison where inmates never know when they're watched, so they behave as if they always are. It's not the bars that control them. It's the gaze. That's the paradox Russell grasped. Fear doesn't always wear chains. Sometimes it wears a smile. And in the modern age, we have confused surveillance with safety, when it may be the most sophisticated fear ever built. This is not a dystopian future, it's a psychological present, and Russell's vision warned us decades before the algorithms ever arrived. Bertrand Russell's core idea is deceptively simple. True freedom is freedom from fear. Not freedom of speech or movement, but internal freedom. A mind not chained by terror, not silenced by self-surveillance. Men fear thought, Russell wrote, more than they fear death, because thought can lead to doubt, to rebellion, to risk. And so society teaches us to fear thinking deeply. The central psychological concept here is what we can call internalized surveillance. It's not just being watched, it's learning to watch ourselves. When you hesitate to question, to speak, to act differently, that's not just fear of others. That is your own mind, shaped by systems that reward compliance and punish deviation. Russell believed that this kind of fear kills curiosity at the root. It makes the human spirit timid, intellectually malnourished, afraid to even imagine alternatives. And in an age of surveillance, the danger is not that we'll be physically harmed, but that we'll no longer know how to think freely. Internalized surveillance is the psychological software of authoritarianism, running silently, invisibly, from within. You monitor your tone, you filter your thoughts, you live not by truth, but by acceptability. Russell's philosophy confronts us here. Can a person be truly moral, truly courageous, or truly wise if fear dictates their choices? In his world, freedom was not a legal status or political slogan. It was a psychological condition. The ability to think without terror, to doubt without shame, to speak without trembling. That is the foundation of Russell's vision of freedom. And in an age of constant observation, it's the very foundation we are at risk of losing. Let's explore this deeper. What does fear actually do to the psyche under surveillance? Fear shrinks the self. It narrows attention, restricts imagination, and reinforces conformity. When surveillance is constant, our nervous system adapts. Hypervigilance becomes baseline. You second-guess your instincts. You rehearse every sentence. You don't ask, "Is this true?" You ask, "Will this be approved?" This is what psychologists call anticipatory compliance. The behavior isn't enforced, it's preemptively offered. The surveillance doesn't need to be real, only believed. And belief shapes behavior more powerfully than fact. Bertrand Russell was not a psychologist, but he grasped this mechanism intuitively. He knew that fear rewires our very process of thought. Not just what we say, but what we imagine becomes limited by invisible boundaries. And this is the paradox of intelligence. The more reflective a person is, the more they can self-censor. Surveillance doesn't need brute force. It needs intelligent fear. Internalized fear that camouflages itself as virtue, or politeness, or doing the right thing. Russell believed the task of philosophy was to break through this illusion, to reawaken thought in a world addicted to agreement. He wrote that the essence of the liberal outlook is to fear suppression more than dissent. And yet today, we fear dissent more, because we've been conditioned to equate disagreement with danger. The psychological consequence is staggering. A population that cannot think freely is not just politically vulnerable, it is existentially lost. Because fear doesn't just govern what we do, it governs who we believe we are. Russell saw this as the death of the self, when you act not from conscience, but from caution, not from truth, but from strategy. And this subtle manipulation, not by force, but by internalized fear, is the greatest psychological tool ever invented by power. The individual becomes fragmented, a private mind censored by its public face. So what remains? A society of selves afraid to truly be themselves. That's the full impact of internalized surveillance, not just watched bodies, but watched souls. And that is the world Russell feared we would inherit. So how does this manifest in our everyday lives? It begins subtly. You type a message, but pause. You reread it twice, wondering if the tone could be misinterpreted. You don't delete it because it's false. You delete it because someone might be watching. At work, you avoid expressing dissent, not because you agree, but because disagreement feels dangerous. On social media, you censor humor, avoid nuance, oversimplify to avoid offending. The invisible audience. In school, students don't just study facts. They study what is safe to say. Even in private conversation, people now edit their thoughts, not for truth, but for optics. What we're witnessing is a cultural anxiety disorder, a collective fear of saying or being the wrong thing. This is not irrational. In an era where one sentence taken out of context can define your identity, fear becomes rational strategy. Surveillance is not just top-down, it's peer-to-peer. Your neighbor can report you, your co-worker can flag you, your past self can haunt you. Every photo, every post, every click is archived. You don't need to be guilty, just interpreted the wrong way. So we play it safe. We sanitize identity. We become less than whole. Consider how people now curate their online presence, not to express truth, but to maintain optics, to blend in, to avoid scrutiny. This is self-branding, not self-expression. And Russell would argue that when we begin to perform more than we reflect, freedom dissolves. This fear even enters relationships. People avoid difficult conversations not to protect the other, but to avoid judgment. Vulnerability becomes unsafe. Authenticity becomes risky. We see this in politics too. Politicians don't just avoid certain views, they often avoid having views, because opinion, in an age of total visibility, is weaponized. The result? Public language becomes hollow, cautious, rehearsed. And Russell would ask, can democracy survive when fear silences the mind? Even in art, we feel it. Artists dilute their message, fearing backlash more than failure. The audience becomes the censor. The result is not harmony, it is mediocrity. In every domain of life, fear has been normalized, and Russell's vision, that freedom requires the absence of fear, feels more distant now than it did in his time. But the signs are clear. We are no longer controlled by violence or brute force. We are shaped by what we're afraid to say. And that is perhaps the most effective form of control ever designed. What happens to the psyche when fear becomes constant but invisible? The answer is fragmentation. You begin to split. There's the outer self, the one that performs, adapts, complies, and then there's the inner self, questioning, fearful, repressed. Over time, the gap between them widens. This is what Carl Jung called a divided personality, the self severed from its shadow. Not because of trauma, but because of surveillance. You no longer trust your own mind. You monitor thoughts before you think them. You anticipate judgment before speaking. And slowly, the self becomes a mask, worn too long, until the mask becomes the face. Bertrand Russell believed this was a spiritual crisis. Not just political, not just ethical, but existential. When fear governs thought, identity itself becomes a performance for approval. You no longer ask, "What do I believe?" You ask, "What belief will keep me safe?" This leads to psychological exhaustion. The constant self-monitoring, the inability to rest within truth, creates what some theorists call learned self-erasure, a slow forgetting of the authentic self. The self that doubts, dreams, imagines, and rebels. Russell's warning becomes clear here. If fear becomes the background music of consciousness, courage dies in silence. And without courage, what remains of a person? A socially optimized persona, acceptable, obedient, afraid. This isn't just a loss of freedom. It's a loss of selfhood. In Jungian terms, the shadow is buried deeper. The unconscious becomes louder. Anxiety becomes chronic. The psyche is now divided between what it feels and what it is allowed to feel. This is the tragedy Russell foresaw. A civilization that fears independent minds will cultivate conformity as a virtue. And the cost? Emotional numbness, creative sterility, moral cowardice. Because fear, when normalized, becomes indistinguishable from reason. You believe you're being rational, but really, you're just being very, very careful. That internal care, the constant scanning, the refusal to speak honestly, is not a symptom of maturity. It's a symptom of quiet psychological defeat. Russell challenged us to resist this internal corrosion. He asked us to preserve the individual mind from the slow suffocation of fear, not by violence, not by rage, but by truth, spoken when it's hardest and needed most. If fear is the foundation, then change begins by dismantling that foundation. But this cannot be done externally. Russell believed the revolution must begin within the mind, not with riots, not with rejection, but with clarity. The first step is awareness. Ask yourself, where does your speech end and your fear begin? Where does your identity reflect truth, and where does it reflect approval? To change fear, we must first see it, not as panic, not as terror, but as silence, caution, withdrawal. Russell encouraged the cultivation of what he called rational doubt, a mind that can entertain ideas without surrendering to them. This is the essence of freedom, not certainty, but courage. Psychological freedom does not require rebellion. It requires honesty. The courage to say, "This is what I believe," even if it costs me. Russell knew this courage would not be popular. It might cost comfort, reputation, even belonging. But without it, society becomes stagnant. Growth begins where fear is no longer in control. This is where transformation begins, when individuals reclaim their inner autonomy, not through defiance, but through deep alignment. To speak as you believe, to live as you feel, to think as if no one is watching. This is not recklessness. This is integrity. A life no longer shaped by algorithms of fear, but by a compass of truth. Russell's message to the future was not a warning. It was an invitation. an invitation to reclaim the mind as a space of freedom, to build cultures that value dialogue over conformity, and to protect the inner world, not by hiding it, but by honoring it. Because a society is only as free as the minds within it, and those minds, yours included, can begin at any moment to dismantle the quiet architecture of fear. It starts small, a question you ask aloud, a truth you no longer silence, a boundary you dare to draw. These are the micro-revolutions that Russell hoped for, not a world without fear, but a world where fear no longer makes the decisions. Freedom, Russell believed, was not a gift granted by systems. It was a condition cultivated by minds. A society may call itself free, but if its citizens are afraid to think, afraid to speak, afraid to be seen, then freedom is an illusion. The cameras do not need to blink. The laws do not need to change. All it takes is the internal belief that honesty is unsafe. This is the quiet erosion of the human spirit. And Russell's philosophy offers us a mirror in which we can see not just what controls us, but how we have learned to control ourselves. But this need not end in despair, because fear, once seen, can be confronted. It begins with one question: what would I say? What would I do if I were not afraid? Let that question echo inside your daily choices. Speak one sentence more boldly. Let silence sit less often. Step just once beyond what's expected. This is how fear loosens its grip. Not all at once, but moment by moment, thought by thought. If Russell were alive today, he would likely not shout. He would. Are we thinking for ourselves? Are we willing to live with discomfort in exchange for truth? Or have we traded inner clarity for outer compliance? We must remember, fear is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers, shaping our lives in silence. And in that silence, something sacred is lost. So tell me this: where in your life has fear become your guide? What would you reclaim if that fear dissolved? Let me know in the comments, not for the algorithm, but for the revolution inside you. In future episodes, we'll explore more voices who challenged the architecture of fear. From Orwell to Jung, from Arendt to Foucault, we'll follow the threads of thought that still dare to resist. Until then, remember, freedom is not the absence of restraint. It is the presence of truth, spoken in a world that prefers silence. Be brave enough to speak it, and brave enough to live it. See you in the next one.